Well, welcome everyone. I hope you had a very nice lunch. I heard that there were insane queues, but I hope you still managed to enjoy it because from what they told me, it was delicious. So here we are today to talk about the lessons that I've learned really hard by building a framework. So developers' favorite answer is it depends. Doesn't matter what the question is. The answer is going to be, it depends. And when you're building an app, this is okay, because most of the times you have the information that you need to talk about those dependencies. But what happens when you're actually building a framework and those dependencies do not depend on your code? Well, I've been working on Android for almost 13 years, and building a framework was by far the most challenging thing that I've done so far. So here I am today to talk to you about the things that I wish that I knew before that, and some of the things that went well and some of the things that didn't really go well. So my name is Eliza Camber. I work at an agency called Makoto. Makoto is an award-winning agency for iGaming operators. And I am also part of the Google Developer Experts for AI and ML. And I live in the land of corgis, and more specifically in London, for those that don't know. So while Makoto is an award-winning provider, we know that we're not necessarily the cheapest one out there. And this is okay. We work in a heavily regulated environment. We're ISO certificated. We don't cut corners. And our apps make time to be built, and we all know what that means. The math is very simple. If you want this to go down, you need to make this to go down. And for you to make the time go down, that means that you have to take time off from all of the development cycle. And by the development cycle, we mean designers, developers, and QA. So we need to figure out a way that we can take all of that development cycle go down. So going back to the drawing board, we realized that all of our apps have many things in common, like some native functionality, like the onboarding or the login, a web view integration, session handling, like user session handling and stuff like this. Also, location querying restrictions, which is the pleasures of working in such a heavily regulated environment. So if we scrap off some of the customization and bespoke features that we do every time individually for our customers, can we also provide a budget-friendlier app to those that are not interested about bespoke functionality, without, of course, compromising any functionality and obviously the code quality? And that's how the idea of the framework was born, the AGF. We built every app using the AGF framework to create a minimal viable product, and then continue building on those building blocks to create customizable features for any client that wishes something on top of that. But as we have the foundation layers for the MVP is quick to the market and commercially competitive. Okay, so AGF is a very creative name for our application gaming framework. Shocking, I know. Anyway, so now we have the idea. The next question is, how do we do that? First of all, I want to go one step behind and say that the framework is not the same with white labels. I've been working in an agencies for as long as I can remember, and white labels just never go right. There is always going to be failing at some point, and I am so against them. Building a framework, though, is very different, because building a framework is basically the foundation of the app, and then you completely build on top of that. You're not trying to redesign things that are there. If it works, it works. If it doesn't, you build it from scratch. So the next question is how do we do that? And oh my God, I'm so happy that you asked, because this is my life for the past year now. So as we said earlier, in order for us to cut down the development cycle time, we need to make cuts to all three. And let's start with the designers first. So for our apps, we obviously need to have the custom branding, and for them to be able to follow the client's guideline. And the designers needed a very quick way that they can still customize everything: the text, the corner radius, the colors, everything. But to do that in a very quick manner as well. So we started using Figma for that, and Figma provides you with a response, a web response. And as ugly as this response comes back, and as massive as it is, it does solve the problem. And so this is like the response. Basically, you have a variable collection, you have modes, and then you have variables, and then values by those modes. This is basically it. So every time that you need something, you go to the value by mode. The mode is something that is coming from the client app, basically, or the component. And then you feed that back to get the actual values. Now, the modes are basically what's making the framework a little different. Because if you have a button, it's going to have a different size if it's like the login button, the onboarding one, or if it's on top of a toolbar. It's going to have like a different size, it has to have like a different font weight, and all of this is different. So this is where modes come into effect. You select the mode depending on where that button, for instance, is placed, and then you get the values for that mode. Also, that beautiful response that we saw so far doesn't always come with a value. Sometimes it comes with aliases. So basically, you just need to get that value. You go back the whole response, you try to find out the actual value of that. If it's still an alias, you go back recursively till it reaches down to an actual value. Cool, so now designers actually have a way to cut down their development time, because basically they just need to provide to the existing designs just the values, and then we get them. So now it's really our problem. For the QA to test everything and to cut down the cost and the time, then we need to figure out a way to move the testing outside of the client app and inside the framework itself. And the idea behind this is very simple, because if you test this, if you build this and you test this, then you don't need to go back and test individually every house if you want to build like a building block or like a neighborhood, for instance. And if you also build this, that means that you can build the entire house, the entire city, just by using integration tests and checking if the integrations happen as they should happen, and not just go with like testing each house every single time. So the house, we call them the components. The neighborhoods, or like the blocks, we call them features, and the other ones are just apps. And components are very simple. It can be a button, it can be a text field, it can be any of those like composable things that we have. Features can either be like completely dependent, or they can have they can be built using the components. They can also be built using other features. So a smaller feature will be a child to a bigger feature. So similarly, if you test every button, then if you go over here and you have like a pop-up dialog, then you don't really need to test every single button again if it has the right colors and everything. And if you test that, then you don't need to test the dialog inside the login feature. So you only test once, but that means that we basically need to provide to the QA a way that they can test every single configuration, every feature, every component every setting for those, and every combination. So we built an app for that, obviously. A very big app, I have to say, but this does provide to the QA the entire flow. So they only tested once, and then obviously if we use those buttons or those text fields anywhere inside the framework, then they don't need to test that again. Cool, so designers now pass it down to the developers, QA passed it down to the developers, and we have our winner. Well, that went well, but no, really, I'm just kidding, because it did went well. Like after that, all you have to do is to structure it in a way that it makes sense for all of the rest, and then you end up with a very nice framework. So one solution is to have all of the moving parts communicating directly with the AGF. So that would be something like this. But in reality, every provider has a different response. So for those responses, we would have like a local package, and that local package would then have to use an universal object, and that universal object to be used in the rest of the framework. But in reality, basically, it ends up like this, because we have an iOS and an Android one. So then you don't only have like the different providers and the different responses and the requests from the providers, but you also have to do it twice. And the more dependencies that you have in general, the less flexible it becomes. And less flexibility also means not scalable at all. Because if we were to decide that we want to have multiple authorization providers, for instance, or multiple location providers, then that looks like this. It's an absolute chaos. Like you're on the fastest track to hell. The APKs would be much larger. And obviously, if you wanted to change anything over here, it's just going to be a disaster. A solution for that would be to have every single one in like a different library that you import whatever it's possible, but really doesn't take away any of those lines, because you still do it twice, one for every provider and once for every platform. So you're still like, it doesn't really take away much of those lines over here. So another idea, and the approach that we actually went for, is that instead of having those APIs to communicate directly with our framework or with our mobile part of that, then we have a middleman. And that middleman is going to be responsible for the mapping. So if you have a response and a request, then that middleman translates it to a universal object, and then that universal object comes into the application, and then you only have to do it per platform instead of doing it every single time for all of them. And that middleman is now part of our framework as well, and it's the web side of it. The idea behind this is very simple. So instead of going from the AGF app to an end client, we basically have an AGF backend now. And we send the requests to our AGF backend. That is going to translate it to the appropriate provider that we are requesting for. It's going to send the request. It's going to get the request from the provider, then map it again to the AGF object and send it back to us. So for our modules, we obviously needed a data layer that's going to make all of the requests for us. And as we saw before, we also have like our features and our components. So we kind of needed also a middle ground for us to translate those Figma responses, for instance, that it's not going to be part of the AGF web client. And we ended up with also an extra layer that is called the design tokens. Now, the biggest dilemma that we had so far was like the client app, to which packages and to which modules should it actually have access to? Because this is a framework and you don't really want any client apps to go back and like overwrite things that they shouldn't overwriting, because it makes debugging really hard. Like, is this coming from the framework, or is the client app just overwriting something that it shouldn't really do that? So the client apps ended up with only having access to the features and the components. And all the rest is going to be hidden inside the framework. So one thing that I really wish that I knew before, but I never publicly made available a library so big, is that whenever you publish a library, if you have internal libraries or internal modules, they are not going to be shipped together. So basically, instead of having just one package, you end up with like 4 imports to your Gradle. Thankfully, with the Libs version, that's not really that bad, because you can create a bundle, as we see at the very bottom, and then in the build Gradle, it's still a single import. And because we only have, we only have the version up there, then even like updating the version is not just going down the whole Gradle as we used to do so many years. So it was okay. I mean, there are still ways to go around this, and we can refactor it, but for now, that works, and we're gonna leave it like this. It's worth mentioning also that in order to ensure that the client app doesn't go and mess around with the rest of like the codes and how we create our branding, we have basically every single class is private or internal, and that means that the client app cannot see any of this. And both the data layer and the design layer, the design token layer, have exactly one access point. And that means that you can only query it, get it, and that's it. You cannot do anything else with that. And that helped a lot our processes. So the responsibility of the data layer is anything that has to do with like network responses and network requests. And that means basically our AGF client. So our repo calls are not very different from what you would normally see to an app as well. So here we just fetch the config, and then we just have the tests as normal. So the data layer is actually very similar to what you would have to any normal application. As we mentioned before, though, there is only one entry point, and the data layer is really just to interact with the design tokens layer. It's not supposed to interact with any others. And this is this fetch method. So from the fetch method, we have an AGF config, and this is a far cry from what we need to end up with, which is our brand. Very similar to how we're providing theming with the material components. And that brings us one layer up, which is the design token layers. And this is where the Figma response is actually translated into the brand itself. So from the fetch config, which we saw that it's just getting the response from the server, we end up here with an AGF brand, which is what the components then can use for rendering the theming. One thing that we can't really do for, like, as you would normally do, is not having a response. Because our whole theming is coming from the Figma response, then we need a baked-in response in case something happens or in case there is no internet access. So we ship it with a Figma response into it as well, and then every time that we query it, we already have the baked-in response, and then when we go down to our layer, to our token parser, then we already have a response over there, and we don't really have to worry about that. If for whatever reason we just let it crash, but this is not something that you would see in like a development build. A final build. So our AGF brand is our little magic helper, and it's hiding that ugly response that we saw and turns it to our theming. So it's a lot of code, and I'm not going to go through all of it. I'm just going to brief through that so that you can understand the points that I have later to say. So basically, we start from the build, And then we go to the build collection, which is one step down to our response. From the build collection, then you have the build mode. From the build mode, you have the extract value and the build value. And finally, you end up with those two, and it gives you back an AGF token value, which is not yet a brand. What we said is that we wanted to have a brand. But the problem with that is that it needs a mode, and the mode is set from the components that are actually using that. So those methods create the map that has all of the values for all of the modes. But obviously, when we want to the components or the composable to just come to us and say like, hey, which is my brand, we don't want to go through all of those every single time. And this is where performance really matters, because with the app, you might go away with that. But when you're building a framework, this is basically where all your best practices for performance really come to life. There are some great talks about how you can check like what is the startup time and what is the build time and all of this, both over here, but also online. So do put the effort to learn how you can actually make it perform a little better, because when you go to more scalable approaches, performance is really important. Anyway, so also over here, we still have our AGF allies things. This is because, again, we don't have the modes, so we don't really know where to go into that map and check that out. And the reason that I showed you this is actually two reasons that I showed you this. The first one is, for the performance, put the effort into figuring out where your code actually creates bottlenecks. And the second one was because this is where our unit tests are becoming very interesting. So a normal test would look like this, because we do test every single function by itself, but then because it goes like down in layers, basically down the rabbit hole, then you need to mock every single function in order for you to go down one. And for a unit test, that is okay. But here comes the fun part. What happens with integration tests? So a normal integration test would look something like this. We create an instance of class B and a list of numbers to sum, and then we call its method and we compare the results. If those are in separate modules, though, you need to mock those. And for us, that would be dozens of methods that we had to mock. So in addition, our Figma structure at that point that we were debating if we should add the integration test or not was still not there, was still not final. So at the beginning, it was quite frequent, the changes, and to maintain the unit test was already a challenge. Putting the integration tests as well, that would have been very time-consuming. So the question is not if we should add integration tests, but the question is like, when do we do that? For now, we thought that any major failures would be cut from our unit tests. And we decided not to add the integration tests so far. Is it a good choice? I don't know yet. I will tell you next year, probably. The component layer is our lowest Android level. So far, everything that we see was just like Kotlin. It doesn't have any Android. So this is our Lego blocks, basically. On top of that, there is at least one more layer that is going to be the features layer, as we saw before. And we now have our branch, but we also cannot pass it like this, right? Because the client app knows nothing about the brand itself. So how do we pass that to our button to get the right one? So if you are familiar with the material design, you basically just create the theme, and then it just like magically, you can get those colors and typography and all of this. Well, if you dig in a bit the library itself, you will end up with something that is called the composition local. And if you try to figure out like what does that provider does, then it says like the composition local is a tool for passing data down through the composition implicitly. So the theme information is always defined on the very top layer, right? So we definitely needed something before we reach our button. And this is how we ended up with an AGF wrapper, as we said. So this is going to get the state of the whole process that we saw so far. And then if it has a brand, if it's loading, then it's going to do this. And then if it's loading, then it's going to use the composition local provider. It will provide the brand. It will provide the modes, because the client app should use modes as well, or can use modes as well. And then it will also provide the typography that it's coming from the client app too. And because we wrap the content like this, then the entire content, the entire brand will be available for anything that is beneath that. And this is how we can query it, the whole brand, from any component now. So you just say like local AGF brand.current, and this is exactly how the local context works, which is not something that I knew till I actually needed that. So you can create your own objects like this in case that you cannot provide them explicitly, then you can provide them implicitly by just using the provider. Well, yes, but nothing comes without some pain at least, right? We are still Android developers. We know that this is happening. So by using the local compositions, our previews become absolutely obsolete. And I understand the reason for that, because every time that you say to the button, for instance, like, hey, this is your color, then it's like, what color? I have no clue about the context of the local provider itself. So I understand why it's happening. We did try to just, so you can't pass down the entire brand as we did, for instance, with our wrapper. But obviously, because we saw before how complex that is, we cannot mock the entire value map that we have. Also, if we get to the preview, we tried to only basically mock or provide the values that that specific component is using, but that didn't work. So this is a problem that we still haven't solved. I've been going to every person that I know to the community, trying to figure this out. If I do, I will let you know. Or if you do, I would gladly hear about this. So yeah, I've never realized how much I have been using that preview window till now. I honestly did not. This is an amazing tool. So that brings us to our final layer, which is our features layer. Some of the features are very easy. They have like similar flows like the components do. Like for instance, the AGF dialog that we have over here. Basically, it's like the components that we saw before. The only difference is that it's using some of the custom components that we have, and it mixes off some like compose standard composables that we have there. So for instance, you have like compose dialog that has an AGF card, which is a custom component. And then it has like another compose standard, which is the box, and then it has like, it's just mixing all of those things. There are two types of features, though, that are unfortunately not that easy to deal with. And the first one are the ones that have a custom or like an entire navigation, like login. So login, you can go to the next screen, which can be like either the biometrics or it can be like an OTP. Basically, it has like an entire flow, and you can't pass it like this, because the client app just doesn't know about this, right? Like, how does it go to a screen that doesn't even have access? Because we said that all of our composables basically have just one class that the client app can interact with, and then the rest is like either private or internal, so they cannot see any of these things. So explicitly going down with the on-click, as we saw with all of them, that's not going to work, unfortunately. So there are two solutions for this. Either you are going to pass the entire navigation controller down to the composition itself over here, or the other thing that you can do is to just give this responsibility to the client apps. So to the nav controller, we can pass it like this over here, but there are three major problems with this approach. So the first one is that this is a very tight coupling, right? So we now have a UI wrapper that it's also having the nav controller, and this does reduce the stability a lot, because it's just complicates things. It's just putting extra things over there, like how do you do that? Then you also violate the singular responsibility, because you have a UI element that it's just a rendering, and then on top of that, you are just putting the navigation responsibility over there. So instead of just rendering things, it now has a navigation too. And we thought that this is like a terrible approach. And in general, this is very, it should be highly avoided in Compose. So the second approach is just giving the responsibility to the client app itself. And to do that, we need to create our graph as we would normally do. And then we need to obviously add the screens to that. So we have like the login screen, and then we obviously have all the internal framework things as well. And then we provide the option to navigate to the login. Now, the client knows nothing about those methods yet. And the framework doesn't know yet what to do with them, because it doesn't have a nav controller. Also, an interesting thing over here is that you can provide like those remember functions, so that the client doesn't really have to deal with like remembering the configuration and all of this. That can go to the framework itself. So yeah, back to our like apps, the client apps. Basically, it just needs to remember the configuration state, because like it has to provide the values for that. And then we add the graph as we would normally do with every other application. And then if you want to navigate there, you just grab the controller, the client controller, this from the client perspective, and you navigate to that. So now that you added the graph, or like the client app added the graph, then you can navigate to any of the components that you have the extensions for. Oh, cool. The second type of feature that complicates things are the one that needs to interact with the very top layer components, like the snack bars over here. Going with the same direction as we did with the login feature here, that's not going to be really an option. First of all, because it's giving a lot of responsibilities now to the client app. It needs to use a scaffold. It needs to use like this specific UI that we're going to get them. And the second one is because we can never really have a full control. If it fails, then we don't really know why it fails. So going back to our wrapper like this, we also knew down the line that we would need like a bottom bar and a top app bar. So that was, we needed something more sophisticated than just a wrapper, and we knew that. So we create a custom scaffold too. Basically, you just provide, again, all of the typography and all of this, and you wrap your content with that. And here, we can see that we can provide the top bar, the app bar, and the snack bar host as we would normally do. But, yeah, this is like how you provide it. But we need to have the snack bar host for us to show that specific one. Normally, you have like the host state and you have the snack bar. And the snack bar is all the composable UI goes to. But this is not good for us because we need that to use the specific UI that we have. So we need to just pass down the data instead of the composable itself. And that data, we then get it and we create the UI and we pass it down. So again, we provide like some really nice, from the framework, some really nice remember functions that the client app can just use like this. One thing worth mentioning is how we allow the client apps to interact with it the easiest way possible. So this is what we do for showing the snack bar. Basically within the data state where we get our host state, and then we provide like show AGF snack bar, and this is how it does. Now, I'm not saying that passing the snack bar host like this, host state, sorry, like this, is ideal or best practice. It's probably just the exact opposite. And it's easy when you're building even an app to just lose, not see the forest for the tree. You get lost in all those best practices and people come back to you and you're like, oh, we should do this and we should do that and we should do the other way. Best practices are there to make your code better and your life easier. It's not there to confuse you, and it doesn't work for everyone. Like, what is a best practice for one project might not be the best practice for your project. Or one best practice may be the exact opposite for what you actually need. And that is okay. Like, you don't really need to follow everything. Sometimes it works. And if that doesn't come with an extra cost, or if it doesn't make your code less testable, it doesn't create like dependencies that there shouldn't be there, that is okay. Like, just go for it. Like during this talk, we saw like all the different best practices and how those do fail. Because for the snack bar host, the best practice that we had for the login feature, those are in conflict. I cannot use the one for the other one. Also, not every decision is going to be the best decision. It was the best decision when you took it with the information that you had, probably. Recognizing and admitting those mistakes and not being afraid to actually talk about them and take the project and put it to a different approach is, for me, what makes the difference between a great developer with the best developer. Everyone makes mistakes. At least I want to believe that. Just not everyone has the courage to go in front and own them. And this is the only thing that you need to remember. Like, no one can tell you which decision was right and which decision was not right, because they did not have the information that you had at that point that you actually took that responsibility to take this decision. And that brings me to another fun part of working, which is the imposter syndrome. I've been working on Android for 13 years, as I said, and every time that when I first started talking about the project, and I'm like, am I good enough for that? Like, can I lead that project? It's still a project that the whole company is going to be based on. And it just never feels right. It's like, oh, what if they found out that I'm not that good? What if they found out that I'm not as good as they thought? They're like, oh my gosh, I made a mistake. Now what? I think that we are all in the same boat. For some reason, we're just not open about this. Again, admitting your mistakes just makes this worse. But it's a very important thing that comes with maturity and seniority inside a company. And even if you know someone, like a developer from your team, that it's really struggling with that, go and talk to them for a bit. Like, tell them that this is okay. Don't be the one person in the entire company that people don't want to work with because, oh, you made a mistake and that, like, I'm gonna hate you for that. Like, no, everyone makes mistakes, and everyone is suffering from the imposter syndrome, or at least like 99% of us, I guess. So if you ever question yourself, am I good enough? Yeah, you got that place, you deserve that place, and you got that place. And no company is gonna come to you and they're like, yeah, you suck, but we still want you. Doesn't work like that. If you are in that room, you already made your way there. Just remembering that, I think that is very important. Be agile, like don't set your project into stone. Sometimes the entire scope changes. Sometimes some libraries get deprecated, like the lovely surprise that we had with the shared encryptions, with the encrypted shared preferences. Things will fail. That's okay. Be agile and be ready to like move on. Don't set it to stone and say like, oh, it's not going the direction that I want. Like, this is it. It's not it. And this brings me to my last point. Think outside of the box. Like, when something doesn't work, there must be a way for it to work in another way. Composable's bottom navigation, for instance, comes with a ton of padding, default padding that you cannot override. We created our custom one. We got the composable code from their library. We ditched all of the paddings that were there for absolutely no reason, and we created our new ones. Just because Jetpack is shipped with those, it doesn't mean that this is the one that you need to create. If it doesn't match your needs and what you're trying to build, just don't use it. And another example that we have is we have a pager that has an overlay inside of it. And that overlay needs to use intrinsic sizes and calculate all of the pages so that we know like what is the size that the overlay needs to have. We are using a pager inside a pager. This is probably the most anti-pattern that you're going to find out. Best practice? Absolutely not. Recommended? No. But we knew that there were going to be at the top like 4 pages onto that. So does it work? Yes. Does it impact any performance or like the code itself? Not really. So for now, it will do. Like, just think outside of the box. Just because it doesn't seem right, it's probably not right. But think about if it really works for your needs without building, like, bringing in more problems to that. Thank you very much.